Snow fell in thin, spiteful sheets, making the alley smell like cold metal and damp wood. Men clustered under the bare rafters of the warehouse, their voices low and flat as if they were counting cattle. Clara Weston stood between crates that smelled of salt and old rope, her wool coat buttoned wrong, hands shoved into gloves that did nothing for the shaking. Her father stood a few feet away, his mouth a hard line she didn't recognize, his eyes smaller than she remembered. He kept telling himself this was debt relief, that it would settle things. The word relief sounded like a stranger in his mouth. They brought her forward like freight, shoved, lined up, inspected. The men nudged articles of clothing, made cheap jokes that left Clara hollow as the spaces between rafters. For a moment she measured what she had been reduced to by how quick and functional their hands were, fingers doing the arithmetic of worth. The crowd's murmur closed over her like a lid. Shame settled in at the base of her skull, sharp and private. Someone cleared a space, and an envelope slid across a crate. The men leaned in. No one asked her name. No one asked her if she wanted to go. The deal was counted in paper and silence. He waited at the edge of the circle, a silhouette like a statue cut from dark stone. Roman Callahan had a face that didn't do small talk, a jaw that didn't trust smiles. He paid without theatrics. His fingers were steady when they closed on the envelope, and when he straightened, the warehouse seemed to remember how to breathe. He didn't smile at her. He didn't speak. He looked like a man who had catalogued injury and loss and built a life around removing them. In the way a mason builds a wall from broken things, they put her in the passenger seat of a black SUV. Heat in the car smelled of leather and perfume, the kind that meant someone had owned danger and kept it pressed close. The city slid past in winter colors, boarded windows, shop fronts with scrolled-down metal teeth, a bus that leaked steam like a tired animal. For Clara, the city had always been narrower than it claimed. It tightened where kindness should have been. When the SUV turned onto a quiet street, the red brick house appeared like an argument with the city solid stern, a building that said, "This is someone's responsibility." Roman stepped out and opened the passenger door. He didn't offer her words that would soften the fact she had been purchased. Instead, he gestured at the house as if naming it an instruction. "She's for my house," he said, the syllables flat as a fact. "4 kids. No mother." His voice held no explanation, only provision, only transaction, only a consequence she had not chosen but nonetheless felt as a sudden, blunt narrowing of distance. No longer the street, but the house, a place where she could breathe and still be bound by someone else's ledger. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and the faint top note of pipe tobacco, old domestic scents clinging to lace curtains and brass fixtures. A portrait of a woman in a high-neck gown watched from the hallway with a softness that belonged to another life. Someone had painted her face with light. Near the portrait lay a scarf, folded with a care that made the fabric seem like a relic. It was Mary Callahan's scarf, red, knitted with a thumbprint of wear at the edge, the kind of object that held a voice in its fibers. The children came forward in a hesitant tide. Caleb was all angles and watchful fists, 14, taller than he should have been, with hands that had learned to hold the world steady. He looked at Clara like a judge seeing a stranger in court, like a boy protecting a thing he feared losing before he had the language for it. Wyatt hovered with a book pressed to his chest, sentences visible on the pages like armor. He measured new people through paragraphs. Nora clung to the edge of a chair, pale as a winter flower, and when she looked up, the room seemed to tilt toward her. Sam, the youngest, peered from behind his sister, eyes like questions. Mrs. Brennan met Clara in the kitchen with a flat, pragmatic examination that wasn't unkind. The housekeeper's hands were papery but sure. She moved through the rooms like someone who'd stitched them together with her bones. "We have rules," she said without malice. "No wandering the basement, no opening the study unless asked. You cook, you clean, you don't make trouble. You will be given a key. You will not be given explanations." Her tone left no room for argument. "You will try," she added softer. "Try, and we'll see." That night, Clara stood by a stove with a whisk that slipped like a small comet in her hand. The kitchen was too bright after the warehouse light that showed every clumsy attempt at confidence. She burned the porridge, and the children watched with a thin, precise amusement that hurt in a way external objects couldn't. It was a humiliation that multiplied quietly. She spilled coffee across a napkin and set a bowl down too hard, so it clattered. Mrs. Brennan's eyes never left her for more than a breath, and when Clara apologized she felt the apology smelled like debt. The early days settled into small humiliations, and the work of not being invisible. Roman's rules arrived on the same tide as the heat bill and the grocery lists. He left notes in an even, readable hand. Kitchen clean. No visitors without informing me. He left fewer notes about the children. When he came home, he came like winter, predictable, distant, cutting. He spoke to the children in short, precise sentences and to Clara in an economy of words. That made her feel less like an elder sister and more like a careful instrument. Clara told herself not to call it luck. Shelter could be another kind of cage, but it was shelter, and she had not had a place to sleep that answered when she knocked. Somewhere, under layers of humiliation and careful apologies, a small part of her had decided to repay the debt she couldn't escape. Learn to be useful. Earn a place in the house where no one spoke for her. There were nights when the house felt less like a work site and more like a family trying on its rightful shape. Sam asked questions at dinner that needed only patience. Wyatt corrected the pronunciation of a word and left a margin of ink where he'd underlined his favorite lines. Caleb, for all his hardness, showed up at Clara's knee to teach her how to tie a knot for the garden, an odd intimacy born of necessity. Nora watched them all with a kind of quiet attendance, and sometimes when she laughed, it was a small thing that warmed the air. Mrs. Brennan found Clara kneeling in the mud of the yard one afternoon, hands brushed with soil, eyes drawn to the derelict strip behind the house. The garden had been given over to saplings and nettles, a survivor's mess. There were remnants: an apple tree with scabbed bark, a raised bed bordered by stones, a cracked watering can. The scarf, Mary's red scarf, lay folded along the sill of the kitchen window, a bright stitch against the house's sober palette. She loved this patch, Mrs. Brennan said, standing with a rake like a walking stick. Mary used to coax things out of the soil. We didn't get many summers like that after, well, if you like digging, do it. Don't expect miracles overnight. Clara surprised herself by liking it. The soil was honest. It told you what it needed in no uncertain terms: water, compost, an absence of weeds. Planting seeds felt like the opposite of everything that had been done to her. A small, consented act. She pressed seeds into furrows, feeling for a moment like someone who might coax life instead of being given or taken. It was Mrs. Brennan who taught her how to water without drowning, how to prune without killing. You are not saving anyone, the older woman said one afternoon, handing Clara a pair of gloves. You are doing the work of making it lighter to live here. It's all the same act of care. The children will notice. The children did notice, but not all at once. At first they treated Clara like the household's newest appliance, functional, unromantic, expected to break under stress but replaced when needed. They tested the seams where she might fray. Sam left toys in the hallway. Wyatt argued over the volume of his reading aloud. Caleb watched, and when he judged something useful, he would pass it along like a coin, maybe a thank you, in the clink of metal. Clara kept to a thin catalogue of tasks. Mend what's torn, wash what's stained, make beds. She learned which plates the children liked and how Caleb took his coffee when Roman wasn't home to watch. She learned that Wyatt marked up his books with small, brutal underlines and that Nora kept a stash of polished stones under her pillow. She learned, too, to keep her past small and folded away. On nights when the house was quiet, when Roman's car keys cut brief lines of shadow through the entryway, Clara found herself listening to the house breathe. In those hours memories pressed up like frost at a windowpane, faces blurred at the edges, hands that once hurt, and hands that once held in strange shapes. She did not tell the children about the warehouse. She did not tell Mrs. Brennan about the way her father looked at her as if he were paying for something he resented. She kept the worst parts like a bruise, visible to her and painful when pressed, but not the whole of her. She also kept a small, stubborn education. Before the warehouse, she had been a nurse's aide, brief training at a community clinic, hands taught to find a pulse like a secret. It was a thing she had done when life was perhaps a little less brittle. She had not wanted to hang the badge in this house or declare herself useful as currency. But when Nora took to coffin in the night and her breath hitched like a wind through a poorly sealed window, those hands remembered before her head did. The fever came on a damp spring evening when the air still smelled of thaw. Nora had been outside earlier, chasing Sam under the apple tree, throwing her small body against the cold without noticing. That night she complained of a chill and lay very still, dug deep into the covers as if warmth were a scarce commodity. Mrs. Brennan fussed at first, then fetched the thermometer. The mercury climbed like a tiny intruder conspiring in the glass. "Call Roman," Caleb said, his voice brittle in instruction with teeth. No one called. The hallway light hummed. Roman's car was not in the drive. He did not answer his phone. It was as if the house waited for permission that did not come. Clara felt the old panic rise, a quick animal thing that had been there in the warehouse and in the dark alleys of her memory. She closed her hand around Nora's wrist and felt the heat that made the skin feel like a cracked egg. Nora's breath was shallow and quick, a small bell hammered by fever. "She needs cooling," Clara said. Her voice trembled at the edges, but the tremor was not indecisive. She went to the kitchen and filled a basin with water that was cool but not cruel. She wrung out a towel and folded it into a compress, pressing it to Nora's forehead. The child didn't complain. Fever had folded her into silence. Mrs. Brennan hovered like a shadow but did not interfere. Caleb stood by the doorway, fists tinked with restraint. Wyatt came close with a book in his hand, as if information could be a talisman. Sam sat on the floor, chin in hands, wide eyes, tracing Clara's every move. Clara thought of nothing. No cures, no salvation, only small exactness. She loosened Nora's collar, changed her linen, wiped her hands with quick motions that thought first for warmth, then for circulation, then for the calm that comes from a steady touch. She sang because the house wanted music. The song she chose had no name in her memory, only a cadence that steadied Nora's sleep. The night lengthened. At some point the room filled with the tick of the clock and the sound of shared breathing. Clara was there in the chair beside the bed with a cup of tea, pressed between her palms and her knees cramped and warm. At some point she dozed and woke to Nora's hand opening in the dark and finding hers. For a little while the house held only the thread between two people's fingers. At dawn Nora's fever broke, as quietly as a small tide. Color crept back into her cheeks like a narrative reasserting itself. When she blinked and smiled, the room seemed to brighten. The children stirred like a chorus finding harmony again. Caleb's jaw loosened. Wyatt sighed and set his book aside. Sam laughed and ran his small hand along Nora's hair. When Roman did return clammy with rain, smelling faintly of metal and the river, he found Nora asleep under fresh sheets, her forehead cool. Clara sat in the worn chair by the bed, a blanket across her knees. The light through the curtains made Roman look older than the photographs had allowed, but he moved with the same calculated economy. He looked at the child, at her breath even, and then at Clara. There was a softness there he seldom let reach his mouth. "You stayed," he said, and the sentence came out less like a question than a fact. "I couldn't leave her," Clara answered simply. Her voice had no pleading in it. It had only the steadiness of someone who had finally decided how to be useful in the world on her own terms. She was burning. Roman's hands were scarred and steady. He stood for a long minute, and Clara thought she might be asked to go. Instead, he reached out and put a hand on the back of Nora's head with an awkward gentleness that looked like someone learning tenderness late in life. "Thank you," he said, which in his world was almost a promise. The children clustered around. There was an air of something sealing the line of trust that forms after someone tends a wound. Caleb's posture relaxed, as if iron had been soft. Wyatt's eyes were damp at the corners. Sam declared it the best night, and waded into the day with the unpracticed conviction of the young. Clara felt the room tilt. Trust is small at first, then gathers weight. It felt like a thing that could be measured in dishes washed without comment, in a child falling asleep on your shoulder, in a stranger watching you and not making a ledger of your presence. Yet she knew better than to suppose the ledger had been erased. Roman paid for what brought her here. Money had not purchased her soul. It had purchased shelter, and perhaps safety, and nothing else. That afternoon, In a room suffused with sun, Mrs. Brennan sat Clara down with a cup of tea, and slid Mary's red scarf across the table like a relic. She liked keeping it near, the older woman said. When things got hard, Mary would wind it until it warmed her fingers. It belonged to the house. It belonged to us. Clara's fingers brushed the scarf. The wool smelled faintly of lavender and smoke to smells that in her life meant respite and loss. Her hands shook when she picked it up. It was silly, she told herself, to be moved by a piece of cloth, but something in the scarf felt like a map out of the old places. She wrapped it once around her wrist and felt an odd steadiness. "Don't confuse shelter with surrender," Mrs. Brennan said, eyes settled on Clara as if measuring the woman she might be. "You can be useful without being beholden. You can stay and still choose." Clara heard the line and repeated it in her head like a prayer not addressed to any god. Choice was a word she had been given, taken from, and now saw strewn in different parts of the house like she started collecting it. Winter had softened into the tentative green of early spring. The apple tree, which had seemed to hold only the bones of itself, pushed out a few brave buds. Clara planted little things rhodesias for quick payoff, a bed of herbs that lent the house a scent that made the kitchen feel less like a hospital and more like the center of living. She worked the soil with hands that remembered how to care, instead of being cared for. The children watched and sometimes joined in, small fingers becoming competent, laughter grounding them in a reality that wasn't built on commerce. One morning, as she knelt in damp earth, Caleb came and sat a small distance away. He watched her hands, the way she pressed seeds into the furrow with a deliberate gentleness. "You know a lot," he said. He did not ask if she had been sold. He did not say any of the things that might make the air inside the house heavier. He only watched, and when she finished he offered her a stick he had whittled into a crude cross for the garden row markers, something he had made with his own impatience for beauty. "We had a garden before," he admitted quietly. "Not many summers kept things alive after Mom." He broke off, the admission a small, brittle thing. Clara covered the spot where she had placed the marker with soil. "We'll make it keep," she said without grandness. "It takes time. We do a little every day." He nodded, a small gesture that meant permission. The house, she thought, was learning to include. There were, of course, frictions. Roman's world brushed the edges of their fragile domesticity with cold reminders. Men from the docks came and left like weather. There were evenings when the house smelled faintly of gun oil and the river. Roman's suits bore stains he deliberately hid from the children. Sometimes the children woke to find him missing, and Clara watched the emptiness left by his absence like a bruise. She refused to pretend the world outside did not exist, but she chose to fight its weight with small, sustained, axe-repaired shirts. Porridge made right, a reading session that became a ritual for Wyatt and Sam. One night, after tucking the children to bed and laying a cool hand on Nora's forehead because habit and care had braided together, Clara sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought of the warehouse. The memory arrived as if called, men picking over what they thought belonged to them, her father's face thin with explanation and regret. It had been an absolute moment, one that the rest of her life would orbit. She had not had time to gather what she needed then. Now she was gathering differently. She had house keys, she had a place to sleep. She had a scarf on her wrist that smelled of lavender and smoke. She had children's small hands in need of guidance. As she wrapped the scarf around her fingers that night, someone knocked on the door. It was Roman. He stood on the porch with a rain-streaked line across his cheek like a fault in stone. "Stay," he said, an unceremonious command that sounded almost soft. His mouth did not break into a smile. He did not explain. The rain made his hair cling to his forehead. Clara looked at him, then at the house that had taken her in by force, and maybe, now, by choice. She considered what it would mean to leave Againwa, came back into an alley with the memory of being a thing. The thought of returning to that life was an icy pulse. "I will," she said, and there was no bargaining in the words. It was not like a wedding vow. It was quieter, a woman deciding what life to live. Roman nodded once and went inside. The house exhaled as if relieved. The children, who had been asleep, slept on, and the portrait in the hallway watched over them all like a soft sentinel. That night, Clara did not sleep the way people do because they are free. She slept the way people do because they have chosen a small, stubborn fidelity. She had been bought by paper and silence. Yes, but she had also been offered work, and warmth, and the slow, daily language of being needed in a way that would let her define the terms. Outside, the apple tree creaked in the cold wind like a sentinel making a small, cautious promise. Inside, Mary's scarf lay folded on the table, the red of it like a pulse against the house's sober colors. Clara rolled it on her wrist, feeling the knit catch at her skin, and taught herself the slow arithmetic of belonging. Sew, tend, wait. The shift, the one that would make people call her part of the family, rather than the woman bought by Roman, was not cinematic. It happened in evenings, not in proclamations. It happened when Sam learned his letters and brought his first shaky attempt at writing to her. When Wyatt put a band of cloth on a stripped page because he thought she might enjoy the marginalia. When Caleb stopped gritting his jaw at the sight of her in the kitchen. But there were other currents, darker and deeper, that circled the house. Men with names like Moretti moved in the markets and the docks, and their shadows made the children tighten up even when the sun shone. Roman's absence at times was explained by business that arrived like storms. He kept the house standing with decisions that had costs, and the house paid for his choices in ways that Clara heard in the clatter of boots on the back steps and the sudden hush that followed certain phone calls. Still, care was a thing that eroded distance. The night Nora had been ill had been a small war won by cloth and patience, and in the echo of that victory Clara began to notice a softening in Ramana look that passed over his face the way dawn passes over a field. It was not fondness in the way memory gilds the past. It was less a feeling and more a recalibration. He began to leave small things for her. A tin of tobacco he didn't open, a jar of sugar. He did not speak of why he'd paid at the warehouse. He never explained his life. He simply made decisions that kept the house intact. If someone asked him why, he would say, "We had no time." It was as true as anything in his ledger. Time, he had learned, could be purchased, but not replaced. Clara noticed he would stand sometimes at the doorway watching the children, and the house felt full of unspoken apologies. On a mid-May afternoon, the children found Clara in the yard with a trowel and a face smudged with soil. She had taken to the garden as other people take to prayer, without rhetoric, only habit. She was planting a row of marigolds by the fence and humming under her breath. Wyatt sat cross-legged on the porch, reading aloud from a battered copy of a book about explorers, and his voice made the air around them gentle. Caleb came and knelt beside her. He picked up the cross she had carved in potato row in the soil as if marking territory against old losses. "Mom would have liked this," he said, and the admission was a small concession. Clara smoothed the earth with her palm. "Then we'll make sure it's here," she said. "For her? For you all." Nora stood a little behind and held Mary's red scarf in both hands, as if it might start a small fire of memory. She lifted the scarf and let it catch the wind, and for a moment it looked like a secret scent aloft. Children's laughter threaded through the yard. Roman watched from the kitchen window, his profile a hard silhouette softened by distance. Clara met his gaze and saw something that was not transparent but not entirely opaque either, the look of a man who had taken in a person and considered what must be returned to him for the privilege of that debt. She thought of bargains and their costs, of how things we offer to survive do not have to mark us as owned forever. When Nora fell ill again, the fever biting at the seams of their calm, Clara's hands did not betray fear the way they used to. They moved with the work of someone who had practiced fidelity and found surety. The house held its breath until it did not, and when Nora's color returned, the children clustered and Roman watched. And something shifted so that Clara, for the first time since the warehouse, felt she had not been appended to their lives, but had become necessary. There was still a long ledger to reckon with, a business beyond the garden. Names that came like storms, but in the quiet, she planted seeds and tended them, and the house began, in most unremarkable ways, to tend back. Spring turned to summer, and the house learned to hold heat and laughter in new ways. Days lengthened into errands and rhythms. A loaf of bread cooling on the sill, Mrs. Brennan humming as she mended shirts. Wyatt crowding the kitchen table with dictionaries and law primers. Sam sprawled on the rug with a pencil and a picture he would insist was for Clara, no matter how many times she tried to peek and say, "That's lovely." The garden thickened with green. Marigolds multiplied along the fence. Basil filled a pot that always seemed to need pinching, and the apple tree, stubborn and scarred, answered with a slow generosity of leaves. Clara moved through these things like someone who had learned a new alphabet. The house felt less like a ledger and more like a set of sentences that finally made sense when read in the right order. She still noticed the absence of being asked, the fact that her life had once been tabulated and paid for. She also began to notice small invitations. Roman setting aside a mug for her without comment, Caleb handing her a jacket on blustery nights, Wyatt leaving a note inside a book simply marked, "For Claire if you ever want to read about ships." Those things were not absolution. They were a kind of rebooting and offer to belong that she could accept or decline. If you want to follow Clara's whole journey, stay with us and subscribe. The invitation hung in the warm kitchen air, and then the narrative tightened again around danger. It came the way threats often did in Roman's life indirect. A shadow on the street, a name muttered at the docks with more meaning than malice. Moretti. He fed rumors into the market like bait. At first, his presence was a nuisance. Then, it became a pressure. Men began to move differently around Roman's corners, and some of them held their hands closer to their coats. One afternoon, returning from a trip to the docks that had nothing to do with the home, Roman walked into the kitchen with a crease between his brows that made the children quiet. The house smelled of sun-warmed bread and basil. The clang of Wyatt's book against the table punctuated the air. Roman stood there, removed his gloves, and folded them like someone closing an argument. "Moretti's been asking questions," he said, without looking at anyone in particular. His voice was the same flat instrument it had always been, but now there was a restless edge. Caleb's jaw tightened. "What does he want?" Roman watched his eldest son, as if measuring how much of the man's fear was protective and how much was inherited. "He wants to take what we control at the river market. He thinks there's money where I leave no ledger. He thinks my attention's elsewhere." The terse way he spoke made the fact of it more dangerous than any swear. The threat multiplied in the days that followed. Men came to the back gate and left quickly when the house's presence was felt. A truck slowed down one afternoon, and a man leaned on its horn in a way that made Mrs. Brennan cross herself and mutter a prayer that was less theological than practical. Caleb began walking the perimeter at dusk. At night, Roman stayed out longer and returned with mud on his soles and a distance in his eyes that tightened the rooms he crossed. Then there was the night at the market. It had the smell of river and salts, and the sound of barges crept like a low animal through the streets. Roman went because Moretti had sent for him with the casual malice of someone trying to take a bank's corner. He left the house with his coat buttoned and his face set as if to meet a necessary injury. Clara watched him go and tried not to catalog every man who seemed to breathe his name with contempt. She tied Mary's red scarf around her wrist in a way that felt like armor and waited with a stillness she had learned watching Nora sleep through a fever. Word came in a bundle of anxious faces. Roman returned late, his jacket torn at the cuff, his shirt dark with a damp that was not rain. He moved as if each step hurt. The scar across his knuckle looked fresher in the kitchen light. When Mrs. Brennan touched his wrist with the tip of a broom handle, there was a small silence. No one asked for the particulars. Roman's life did not invite curiosity so much as speculation. He slipped off the coat and sat heavily at the table, an unsteady man who had chosen violence and paid for it. Clara's hands, which had been quick with porridge and careful with seedlings, were quicker with bandages. She washed a cut near his shoulder with a cloth and warm water and muttered nothing of blame. She worked with the practical patience of someone who knew the body's language. Roman did not speak while she worked. He let her do the small ministrations, the sheet of towel between him and the world. And sometimes, when she looked at him, she saw more than the wound. She saw the small ages of a man who had chosen a life that required bodies to hold danger. "Don't make a show of this," he said finally, the words low and brittle. They carried his old instincts: control, minimal exposure. She tied the bandage with a deftness that made him look surprised. "I won't," she answered, "but I'm staying." Her voice was steadier now. not the acquiescence of something forced, but the firmness of a decision. She had choices. This one was deliberate. He watched her across the light. There was gratitude in his face that looked like an apology. The wound, though patched, did not close clean. A cold rain and too many nights on unsteady benches made him vulnerable to something smaller but slower, pneumonia. He came home 6 days later with a cough that wrung the corners of his mouth and a fever that folded him inward as if he were trying to hide from himself. The house shifted around him. Where before it had adapted to the rhythms of a man who left and returned, now it leaned toward him with a new urgency. The ledger had never been so small as a pulse. When he fell sick, Roman's illness was not melodramatic. It was steady and consuming. He slept with a hot compress at his temples and woke with a hand in the place where Clara's had been the night he was carried in. She refused to leave his bedside. Those were the days when she traded garden gloves for the task of turning cold rags and making broths that smelled faintly of hope. Mrs. Brennan orchestrated the seasons of his care-hurt hands efficient and exact hand. The children adopted small roles. Wyatt bringing half-read news articles about treatments, Caleb sitting long hours without speaking, Sam bringing warm socks like an offering. Roman, who had given orders for so long, learned to accept without command the rhythms of care. He would open his eyes at odd times and see Clara by the window, Mary's scarf laid beside the basin, and something like shame would pass over his face. "I'm sorry," he murmured one afternoon, in a voice that sounded like someone surrendering an old coin. Clara folded the scarf into a pillow and put it behind his head. "Don't be," she said. "Be better if you can." Her refusal to leave was not stoic it was choice. When the fever spiked at 2 a.m. and Roman's breath shortened like a thread being pulled taut, Clara cupped the shape of his cheek and hummed the same nameless tune that had steadied Nora. The song had no particular origin, only a cadence that stitched the room together. Roman's hand found hers and held it for a long time, not with the grip of possession, but the grip of needing someone to anchor him in the world. The children watched, and what changed in them was not one simple feeling, but a rearrangement of what family looked like. The man who had been a distant architect of decisions now lay vulnerable and small, and the woman who had once been a thing given away moved around him with the certainty of kinship. Recovery was slow. There were days when Roman could not stand at the window without support. Days when Mrs. Brennan fussed over the quality of his soup, as if she were adjusting the compass needle of the house. The more Roman regained strength, the more awkward tenderness crept into small acts. A cup of coffee left cooling where Clara would find it. A note in a margin of Wyatt's book. Good chapter, keep reading. It was clumsy, as if two people were learning a language they had only ever overheard. When Roman finally came out into the garden on a clear morning and smelled the basil, he stood there as if unfamiliar with the smell of life that had not been catalogued for currency. He picked up a marigold stem between two scarred fingers and let the child Sam show him how to tie up a tomato plant. The scene was not cinematic. It was ordinary. It was the sort of moment that, stitched together with others, made a life. One evening, sometime after summer had mellowed into the golden hours of early autumn, Roman took Clara to the apple tree. The garden had become thick with the work of many hands. The apple tree bore small fruit, and Mary's scarf lay draped over the low branch like a banner. The children were inside, setting the table for a simple supper. Mrs. Brennan called to them from the kitchen with the kind of voice that had the authority of someone who had seen too many things to be surprised. Roman stood with his hands deep in his pockets. He had not been a man who did ceremony well. His face betrayed a puzzlement at the idea of making promises. Yet he had done a different kind of labor, one that had nothing to do with the crime he orchestrated and everything to do with the quiet acts that made home. He turned to Clara, and for once his words were not sharp-edged with utility. "I can't promise you safety," he said, and there was the truth, as plain as a wound. "I can promise the house, the children, a name. I can promise that I'll keep trying to keep wolves from the door. But I can't promise the world won't come for us." Clara folded the edge of Mary's scarf between two fingers. The red wool pressed warm and familiar into her skin. She considered the ledger of her life, the purchase in a warehouse, the years of being catalogued, the small freedom of choice she had reclaimed. He had given shelter by money. He continued to offer it by labor and by assuming risk. "Then ask me," she said. Roman blinked as if the simplicity of the phrase cleared something inside him. "Will you stay? Will you stay with us not because you have to, but because you choose to? Will you be our family, Clara? Will you marry me?" When he added the word marry, the world contracted and then opened up in a way that felt both precarious and rooted. Marriage here was not a white dress and proclamation of forever. It was a contract of mutual choosing, a name spoken aloud to anchor a life. Clara felt every weight and every lightness of the offer. To say yes would be to bind herself to a man whose life had cost others. To stay single would still mean staying with children who had learned to rely on her. None of the choices were without cost. She held his gaze. The apple tree shivered in a small breeze. The scarf slid from her fingers and twined around her wrist. "I will stay," she said, and when she added, "I will marry you," it was because she wanted to. The words were not the end of nuance. They were the beginning of a new ledger, one she would sign with the same insistence she had used to plant seeds in the yard. The wedding was small in the way only a house can make small things matter. There was no showy reception, no congregation of men who nodded for appearances. Instead, there was a table by the window. Mrs. Brennan, arranging a bouquet, with an eye narrowed in concentration. Wyatt, folding a piece of paper into a pretzel shape and declaring it a keepsake. Caleb standing with an awkward pride like a man newly given the honor of gentleness. The children helped scatter petals from the marigolds over a small bit of cloth. Mary's red scarf was tied to a chair back and fluttered like a flag. They married Simpano grand vows, shouted across pews, no promises beyond what they could reasonably keep. Roman's hand trembled a little when he slid a ring onto Clara's finger. She put a simple band onto his. It fit over the scarred knuckle like a truth settled in place. The house seemed to exhale as the seasons turned. The garden, once a neglected patch, answered with a vividness that felt almost like a rebuke to the violence outside its borders. The children grew into the soft architecture of a family that knew how to mend itself. Time did the usual work. Summers and winters folded into one another. Small losses and bigger ones laid their own markers. There were still nights when men spoke loudly in bars and at docks, when Roman had to go and return with his face a little more guarded than before. There were still consequences to choices made. A cousin caught up in a rival's crossfire. A man who had once been a friend now missing. A funeral that Mrs. Brennan attended with a practiced stoicism. The cost of Roman's life, threaded through the years, like a hidden route. Yet in the yard, the apple tree held firm. The sign they made one spring naive and fierce hung on the gate. Not for sale. Caleb insisted on the wording. Clara insisted on the tone. They wanted the garden to be a place that refused to be measured in currency. People laughed at the sign at first. But then the neighborhood learned to come and pick apples and share a pie or two. A small market stand appeared some Saturdays where Roman never allowed money to change hands. Instead, neighbors were encouraged to take what they needed and leave what they could, sometimes vegetables, sometimes a song. It was a quiet revolution that made the house a different kind of center. The children grew in different directions, each shaped by the blend of home and the shadow that had narrowed and yet taught them endurance. Caleb, who had begun as a coiled protector, found ways to reroute his vigilance. He apprenticed in the family's legitimate enterprise Sysadocks and the warehouse that Roman partially owned, but he used his seat to insist on fairness. Better pay for workers, safer loading practices, no more deals that put neighborhoods at risk. He moved slowly, as all reformers do, one policy at a time, and people noticed the change. Some of Roman's old associates scoffed. Others, seeing the steadiness of a man who chose a different measure of power, began to follow. Wyatt did what he had always hinted at. He went to law school. He became a small-lane lawyer who offered his time to clients who had once been invisible in courtrooms. He defended people who had been manipulated by men with ledgers. He learned to read contracts like an archaeologist reads ruins, looking for the fracture points where people were exploited. In courtrooms, his voice was less like a hammer and more like a careful saw, quiet, precise, relentless. Nora, once fragile, grew into a woman who treasured her scarred fragility as a map. She kept Mary's red scarf safe in a chest and wore it on certain mornings when the house needed a reminder of continuity. She became a nurse, the small and tender kind in a way that both honored and rejected what had once been done to Clara. She married a man who taught children in the neighborhood and kept their porch light on for late trips home. Sam remained small-spiritedly generous. He became a teacher, following a path that felt like the softest possible rebellion, choosing to give people tools instead of taking. He read to neighborhood kids in the garden under the apple tree, and sometimes he coaxed reluctant teens into reading the maps the city had not drawn for them. Roman watched them grow with a complicated tenderness. He sat many nights alone, hands folded, thinking of the life that had made each of his children both vulnerable and capable. He had chosen the line he had walked for reasons that were never simply malice, survival, inheritance, a kind of grim practicality, but he also had learned that hoarded power was a poor legacy. The house became his attempt at reparation, imperfect and often messy. He aged in the ways trouble ages men who have skated close to the edge. There were nights when he coughed, and the sound made him flinch. There were conversations with doctors that lasted too long and used phrases like long-term care and respiratory impact that sounded like judgment. Clara took his arm one afternoon and brought him to the bench under the apple tree, and they sat with the sun making freckles across the worn wood. He looked at her and, without melodrama, said, "I don't regret bringing you here." Clara's answer was simple and true. "You made choices that harmed others," she said. "You also mended other things. We are both of those things." He tilted his head, accepting the complexity. "Good," he said. "Then, we're honest." Years blurred into the kind of ordinary chronology that marks a life. Birthdays, scraped knees, graduations, an argument that made the house hush for a single night, then forgiveness that looked like a pot of stew left on the table. Mary's red scarf kept appearing in small ways, knotted on a chair, looped through a basket handle, tucked into Nora's bag. It became less a relic and more a belonging, woven through the days. Clara grew older, in the way people who have labored with their hands do. Lines at the corners of her mouth, soil ingrained beneath her nails she could not always wash away, a steadiness to her gait. She walked the house in the mornings and checked windows and cupboards and the place where she kept the small medicines and the children's drawings. She cultivated the garden into something of a sanctuary. Sometimes she read under the apple tree in the afternoons until her eyes grew heavy, and she would wake to find Sam or Wyatt's small hand tugging at her sleeve to remind her to come inside for tea. One autumn, as leaves stitched the ground in a slow burn of russet and gold, Clara felt an exhaustion that was not only the kind the body accumulates, but also the kind the soul experiences when it is full. It came like a tide in the night, small at first, then a tide that would not be turned. She grew tired of walking rooms. She grew tired of repeating lists aloud. She began to rest in the afternoon and slept with a blanket closer over her, as if to keep the warmth of the house against her ribs. The children, grown now, recognized the signs that come before farewells. They rallied like people who had always understood how to gather. Wyatt took leaves from his law schedule. Caleb left a job meeting to sit at the foot of the apple tree with a Nora pressed Mary's scarf into Clara's lap and would not be persuaded it was unnecessary. Sam read children's stories out loud until his voice caught in the way it always had, as if telling tales could mend the world. Clara met the end, as she had lived much of her life, with fierce attention to the small things. She asked Roman to put his hand in hers and watch the garden. She asked Mrs. Brennan to fix the pocket of her favorite jacket and to make sure the seeds were tucked away in the shed. She asked each child for a promise. Do right by the garden. Be kind to strangers. Keep the apple tree watered in dry years. When she died, it was a slow closing, not a dramatic event. The family gathered around the bed in the room that had once been a stranger's sleeping place. They spoke in low voices that felt like prayer but were less formal stories. Small complaints, gratitude. Clara's last smile pulled at nothing and everything. A woman who had been sold and had become a keeper. They buried her under the apple tree in early spring when the ground was soft and the roots were waking. The scarf, Mary's red scarf, was folded and placed gently atop her chest. A bright, warm stitch. Roman stood at the edge of the grave with hands that had shaken more than once in his life. He put his palm against the tree, as if to steady himself for the span of years he had left. After the funeral, as days gave way to months, Roman carried on the small duties Clara had left with an awkward fidelity. He attended to the weeds in the garden with a kind of stubbornness, as if the act of keeping the earth free of chokegrass honored her. He learned to make the beds she had made, measured the bread the way she did, and set aside a small pot of marigolds near the back steps. He aged further, as men of his type often do, with a weight of history evident in his gait. His cough returned in the cold months, sometimes fierce, sometimes merely a reminder that life has debts it will always collect. He had lived long enough to see the children become the kinds of adults who reshaped his choices into something else. He had also lived long enough to feel the quiet of nights without a woman's even breathing to cue the cycles of sleep. One winter morning, winters later, the house woke to a stillness that was different, less the holding breath of grief and more the closure of a long, necessary chapter. Roman was found in the kitchen, sitting at the same table where he had once counted ledgers. His hand lay next to a folded piece of paper, a note perhaps, a fragment of a life that had finally allowed rest. The funeral that followed was not grand. It was a group of people drawn by ties of blood and improvised loyalty. They buried him beside Clara beneath the apple tree. Mary's red scarf lay folded between them, like a seam in the soil that stitched their lives together. Mrs. Brennan, who had once guided a sold woman toward the rows of a garden, stood, with a stoic face and a heart that had learned how to name it. In the years after, the garden remained. The apple tree grew broad and generous, its branches loaded with fruit that the neighborhood came to claim each fall. Children ran through the rows. Neighbors sometimes brought pots of soup. A small stand dispensed extra produce to those who needed it. Caleb's efforts at fairness in the warehouses became a model for those who worked the docks. Wyatt argued cases that saved lives from exploitative contracts. Nora's nursing clinic sat a few blocks away, providing care to those who could not pay much. Sam taught in the small morning school by the park and brought children to the garden to learn where food came from. Generations came to climb the apple tree. Great-grandchildren ran between the marigolds and the raised beds, their laughter a rough-edged music. Mrs. Brennan's chair remained on the back porch for a long while, and then it passed to others who sat in the same place and made the same kind of small watch. Above the gate, the sign "Not for Sale" hung, weathered and slightly crooked. People would ask about it, and the children would reply, some with pride, some with a shy remembrance about the woman who had been bought and had turned the purchase into a home. They told the story the way stories are told, with a mixture of tenderness and hard-earned realism. They never glossed over the theft of Clara's autonomy. They never framed Roman's earlier life as heroic. Instead, they told of how a woman took an impossible set of circumstances and made a space where children could learn to stand differently. They spoke of the cost and of the salvage. A garden, a scarf, a promise kept in small, daily ways. Sometimes, beneath the apple tree, a child would ask for Mary's scarf and be told the story of a woman who sewed the world together. The scarf became less about the woman who had worn it and more about the continuity of care. It was a fragment of red against green that held stories. In that way, the house Ramon's house, Clara's house, the Callahan house became a testament not to the neat absolution of a sin paid, but to the slow work of repair. It held contradictions, people who had harmed and people who had healed, choices that had been made in desperation and choices that were made in love. The children and the people who came after learned to live among those contradictions. When the last of Clara's great-grandchildren climbed the apple tree and fell asleep in its dappled shade, the family gathered beneath the branches and told the old stories. They spoke not only of the warehouse and the envelope slid across a crate, not only of the man who paid, but of the woman who stayed and planted seeds. They remembered Mrs. Brennan's hands and Mary's red scarf. They remembered the nights of fever and the nights of broths, the small weddings and the quiet funerals. They remembered that the garden had once been a wild tangle and that someone had taken the time to prune it. It was a messy, honest legacy. It was not there to excuse anything. It was there to say that people can change the shape of what they inherit if they put hands to work and refuse to let the world count them without asking. The sign above the gate had been right, not as a boast but as a boundary. Some things are not for sale. The apple tree kept giving fruit. The scarf, when it appeared on a small wrist of a new boy who came wandering through the gate, seemed to pulse with the faint scent of lavender and smoke. The garden hummed with bees and children, and the kind of noise that made the city behind the red brick. house feel less like a threat and more like a neighbor. Clara's story stayed alive because people told it, and because those who benefited from it chose to act with the same stubborn care she had seeded. It was a life that began in an act of ownership and ended in an expansive, hard-won belonging chosen again and again by people who, having been given a place, decided to keep it kind. If this little life touched something in you, how a person reclaimed dignity, how care can remake a home shattered with someone who needs to hear that homes can be rebuilt. Tell us in the comments about someone who gave you a place to stay when you needed one.